To navigate inside the video, there are timecodes in the description. There you will also find links to everything marked by this symbol during the tutorial. Hi, I'm Monk. I'm a German artist that's currently exploring the world of 3D creations with the help of Blender. Welcome to my very first YouTube tutorial. Be aware that this is not a step-by-step tutorial. Rather, I will try to share universal explanations, tips and techniques that I used and learned while creating my movie recreations. I already recreated 5 other movie frames previously, and where it makes sense, I will use examples from these to explain certain things. The scene I will mainly use for this tutorial is the kitchen fight in The Raid 2, especially the last frame of it. I will get into why I chose this particular movie and scene at the end of the video. Before this becomes a Blender tutorial, I will explain a bit about where the whole concept of recreating movie frames in Blender comes from and what you could gain from doing it. Storytelling and composition are at the core of every great art piece, from a great song over a dance performance to a painting or a movie. What makes studying movie frames so great is that you can always study the visual elements of a single shot in the context of an overarching story. And since movies are such a widespread form of art, the supply of study material is sheer endless. The first time I came in contact with the concept of studying movie frames was in a Facebook group for digital drawing and painting. In drawing and painting, you could study the composition of a scene and how color was used in it, and then think about how they both contribute to set a certain mood and enhance the story, without ever having to draw faces or most of the background. I just took the concept of painting movie studies and adapted it to 3D. My main goal with this whole thing was to, in the end, have a better understanding of the core relationship between modeling, materials and lighting, and to learn which of them to manipulate to get closer to a cinematic looking result. All this while training and speeding up my workflow. This also involved not to rely on a model library and to model everything from scratch. This certainly isn't the most efficient way for creating a scene fast, but it allowed me to learn an incredible amount and get results that apparently look very close to the original screenshot. To start your own study, you can either take an existing shot from a movie still archive like Film Grab, or take a screenshot yourself while watching a movie on your computer. Even if you took a shot from Film Grab, watching the actual scene is essential for collecting references. I will collect these references in the free program PureRef. I will do this for the whole scene to get a general feeling of it, even before opening Blender for the first time. But I will also rewatch the scene over and over during the creation to pull additional references. In the end, this is how my reference board looked like. If you're lucky, you will even find your particular scene in making of material. In my case, it even further showed that they mainly used practical lights to light the scene. Practical lights can be seen within the frame, but are also used to light the set and actors, in the difference to pictorial lighting, which are off-camera lights or also called beauty lights. This was especially good news for the animation I wanted to do, since it's much harder to hide film trickery once the camera starts to move. So, you found a frame you want to recreate, and you made yourself familiar with the scene and started to collect some references. Let's start up Blender and start our study. Once in Blender, the very first thing we need to do is to calibrate the camera. For pictures with clear vanishing lines, this can be done with an add-on called Blam. Loading the screenshot into the movie clip editor, you can then draw different grease pencil lines onto it. Blam then uses these to calibrate location, rotation, and even the focal length of your camera. Blam works pretty reliably in the most cases. But for this one, it somehow wouldn't want to line up. So I struggled for over an hour to get it to a point where it worked, with the least amount of compromises at least. I don't know exactly why it wouldn't work, but it's a great segue to quickly talk about a set design technique called flying walls. Flying walls are walls on a film set that can be moved or even removed to make room for the camera. In the making of from The Raid 2, you can see how in another scene, the set design is exactly designed like this. And in the shot I'm recreating, they removed a pillar visible in another angle to allow the camera to see more of the room. Since Blam only works with parallel walls and square angles, flying walls can be a reason why it won't work. If you don't have clear vanishing lines, you can still use Blam if you draw on an imaginary floor plane in Photoshop and use this to draw on the grease pencil lines. No matter how you calibrated the camera, once you've done it, it's time to start with the modeling. If I'm working on an interior scene, I will always start with the base room to have references at all sides. The floor of that room should always sit at a Z value of 0. It additionally helps to set the scale to a unit and create everything in a reasonable size. Generally, you can say that Blender produces much better results when you work in an approximately real-life scale. What I always do is to add a basic cube with the origin point at the ground surface and have the cube also sit at a Z value of 0. This way, to build furniture, for example, I always start with a reference to the ground and can judge overall position and scale of objects much better. Since even rough objects very quickly shape the light of a scene thanks to global illumination, I will add rough lights very early. To learn the most, it helps to start using the trifecta of modeling, materials and lighting as early as possible in your scene. As you can see here, I'm not particularly interested in working clean. You wouldn't design production-ready assets this way. But since it's just a study, I save time where I can. To create the handles for this trolley thing, I will use a Bezier curve with a bevel object. These can be used for pipes, hoses, handles and other stuff and are a great tool to have. Another great tool to have is the array modifier. Here I use an array modifier to duplicate the dark patches in a quick way. The array modifier also came in handy while creating the wine shelf, these floor mats and these baskets in the background. Modifiers in general are incredible little helpers and you shouldn't underestimate them. Here I use a wireframe modifier to create the legs of the table rather than modeling them each. And here I use a mirror modifier to keep this bowl symmetrical. Even just using a few basic modifiers in your scene can save you a lot of time. Another time saver are instances. You can make a duplicate of an object, but also an instance. Not only do they allow you to propagate materials and modeling changes instantly, they also save up memory and time while rendering. I use both duplicates and instances while creating the different bowls and also while creating the wine bottles. When you want to really quickly just block out a shape, especially for sculpting, metaballs can help you with that. Just add as many as you like and scale and position them. Once you are finished, you can just convert them into a mesh for further use. Another modeling technique I used was to go into the top-down view and use a background image to model the knife our hero is holding. To create the broken wine bottles, I used the cell fracture add-on and then a rigid body simulation to break the bottles into pieces. Another simulation I used was a quick cloth simulation with a pinned vertex group to create a towel on the wall. To have simulations so easily available and integrated into the workflow is one of Blender's big advantages. An additional tool I used while creating the broken bottles was the knife function. I used it to create this broken bottleneck. To create the piles of broken glass, I used a simple plane and edited it into a pile using the different modes of the proportional editing tool. On top of that, I ended up using a particle system with a slightly deformed cube as a glass particle. Getting these to look like in the screenshot was not easy. I will get into that when I talk about the materials. Another little help I use from time to time is the select menu. Especially checker select can help you create patterns, often found in interiors. It's also an awesome way to just waste some time while playing around with it. To model what I would guess is lemongrass, I added loop cuts to a plane and edited it into a single strand. I then added variety and started duplicating them into little bundles. By creating variety at different stages, you can model nearly all grass, weeds or similar plants this way. I completely ignored creating proper character models for all previous recreations. Till this one, I made characters out of very simple shapes and used a screenshot to texture them by simply plugging the texture into the camera input. I only did this to create the right shadows and glowy illumination in the scene, since I knew I would later overlay them in Photoshop. But for this one, I knew I wanted to do an animation, and this simple approach just wouldn't work. So I ended up doing them in Adobe Fuse. You can basically do the exact same thing in the free program MakeHuman, but since I didn't even know Fuse existed, I just wanted to see what it was capable of. The last thing I'm going to talk about in modeling will be how the 360-degree camera move added to my process, since the base idea is just to recreate a single shot. I added the path for the camera move very early to see how much I need to model and what amount of detail each object needs. The camera move works with object constraints. One, to track the camera to a focus element, like an empty, and then a follow path constraint to a circular Bezier curve. Since the whole scene is lit using practical lights, I didn't have to worry about that part, and the camera move mainly added additional modeling work. Using my references to grasp the position and size of each object was more tricky than actually modeling most of the stuff, since I mostly rely on very basic techniques. Once an object is modeled, it needs a material. What has to be said about my materials is that I'm working on 2.78. Therefore, I won't use the principled shader that comes with 2.79. Generally, it's always better to use this shader and save yourself a bunch of node work while setting up your materials, and get more realistic materials as a default. Problem is, I currently can't reliably render in 2.79 on my machine. Another thing is that you should be familiar with the basic workflow of PBR textures if you want to create realistic results. I only used actual PBR textures for the tiles on the floor in this scene, but knowing how PBR textures are used teaches you how physically correct materials work in general. The textures I'm currently showing are from cc0textures.com. The site is an ever-growing collection of high-quality 8K PBR textures that are completely free. With the materials, as with any other thing, you always have to consider how far you want to push it and where to save time. Use your modeling to help your material process wherever you can. For these studies, I also skip UV unwrapping things unless it's really necessary. As long as I only use procedural textures, this isn't a big problem. Just using the procedural materials from Blender can bring you to 80 to 90% in the most cases, what often is enough. They also save memory and don't break down once you edit the object. You can help your material process in the modeling, but this also works the other way around. To save polygons, these wine bottles, for example, have no wall and are completely solid. I now use the transparency node combined with the glass node to compensate for that in the materials. For the piles of broken glass, I tried around with many different variations of transparency, translucency, glossy and diffuse nodes. But after not getting the results I wanted, I ended up using a very simplistic material for the glass particle. While doing these film studies, I really learned to appreciate texture painting. I used it in this one for the blood and some shoe scuff marks on the floor. For the blood splatter, I created a brush out of a grunge texture and used different settings to control the mapping of that texture. I then drew on the blood texture by switching between the object and rendered view to get a 4 to 5 second glimpse at the background image. As a result, you can see how the texture spreads out from the camera point of view. So this feels more like cheating rather than using a real technique, but for the still image at least, it works without a problem. But painting the textures is only one part of the work. The other is to build a material and then use those textures in them. Once you got your textures in your material, color ramps will become your most used tool to control their influence. To simulate that the blood gets thinner and therefore brighter on the edge of a puddle, I use this color ramp to control a mix of differently bright blood setups. Color ramps are also a must while using textures on the roughness of a node to create surface imperfections. A node that lets you achieve certain effects based on the viewing angle to the surface of an object is a layer weight or a Fresnel node. To a certain point, these are implemented in the principled shader, what gives you the more realistic default results. The shimmering of oil as you change the viewing angle is a perfect example for this. I used it here to create this faded, used plastic look of these baskets. To make the faces of the characters, I used the texture that came with the human models and modified them in Photoshop. I will get to that in a minute. And that's basically it with the materials. For the specific case of recreating movie frames, it's not about creating the most complex materials, but about learning the correlation between the materials and the light that hits it. Speaking of lighting, it's a complete topic on its own. Good lighting can make or break any scene. You could put hundreds of hours into modeling a scene and then waste its potential with the wrong lighting. But recreating movie frames can teach you how not only the actual lights themselves influence the lighting, but also the objects and the materials inside the scene shape the light. That's where going through the scene and making yourself familiar with it becomes so important. Knowing if there are additional light sources or things that could change reflections and the global illumination is super important. Even when you never plan to move the camera, you should still consider what is happening around it, for realism purposes and for storytelling ones. To create my lighting, I rely on 3 different types of lights. HDRIs as environment light, blender lamps, and the emission node in the materials. HDRIs are an awesome way to quickly get realistic lighting and reflections. Thankfully, you can get free, high-quality HDRIs from HDRI Heaven to cover your basic needs. To get the harsh shadows for the Inception room, I used the JPEG version instead of the EXR file of a blue sky HDRI. My guess is that it has to do with then more of the bright parts clipping into white, but I didn't investigate it. It somehow worked. Additionally, I used a very strong spotlight with a very tight angle that was extremely far away. When using such a bright exterior light, giving up glass windows is very important to decrease the amount of noise and fireflies inside your room. Another type of blender lamp is the area light. For the Valhalla Rising one, I used a bunch of area lights all around the background of the scene. Since this scene is so simplistic from a modeling standpoint, I knew I had to focus on this incredible soft lighting and the mood that lives from it to make this image work. I also hadn't planned to make an animation out of this one, so I didn't really care about the render time. That's why I used real volumetric fog to scatter the light from all those area lights. Using a mix out of a volumetric scatter and a volumetric absorption node to create that fog. I used the most amount of blender lights in the Prisoners one. Every one of these cones is a separate light. I even used lights to create reflections where there weren't any naturally. The only lamps I used in this one are the spotlights in the wine cellar and some area lights to simulate the adjacent rooms. For all the other ceiling lights, I used the emission node. The emission node is one of my favorite things in Blender. To be able to make any object glow that easily was one of these things that hooked me very early in Blender. I used the emission node here to create actual fluorescent light tubes. I then used the height of the lamp housing to control the angle of the resulting light cone. Yet another example of the relationship between light and modeling. And that's it with the tips for modeling, materials and lighting. I will now get into how I use Photoshop in my workflow and what you should look after while color grading your final image. I couldn't imagine myself not having a graphics program open while working in Blender. Most importantly, to create and change textures. I'm using Photoshop for this, but there are incredible free or cheap alternatives out there that can basically do the exact same. I just use Photoshop out of pure convenience. The first thing I did in Photoshop was for the references. I stitched together frames from a single camera move to have more information in a single picture. 2 textures I modified in Photoshop were the skins for the character. I used the textures that came with the Adobe Fuse model as a base. I then stitched together the face of the respective character out of different camera angles. I also used blood splatters on the hand and made a mask texture to be able to separate the blood and the skin shaders. Another texture I created in Photoshop was the super advanced beer label. I also used Photoshop to create backdrops here, here and here, using the perspective warp tool to straighten the image, to then use it on a subdivided plane as a window backdrop. Once I have reached a certain stage with the scene, I will start rendering out small test renders. I will render these out with the Filmic color space and the basic contrast look applied. For the final render, I won't use a look to have the absolute most information to apply a color grade. I will then use Photoshop to scribble notes directly onto these test renders. I split them into modeling, materials and light, and erase the notes as I further work in Blender. I then won't render out the next test render till I cleaned the layer of all nodes. Working in those kind of steps helps you to keep track of all the details you are spending time on. This way it's easier to actually call it done when the additional time you need to invest just isn't worth the tiny bit of added realism anymore. Once I have decided to call it finished, I will render out my final image for color grading. Color grading is a whole different topic and a science on its own, and I won't get deeply into it in this tutorial. There is a reason why color grading can be a job on its own, separated from the editor. Besides modeling, materials and lighting, I would argue editing your raw render could be named as a fourth pillar of a great Blender artwork and creating a cinematic look. If you don't know why your color space matters or why you would want the render to be as flat as possible, I recommend checking out great videos on this topic. You have to learn how much of a look can be created inside of the scene with modeling, materials and lighting, and how much will come from the edit. If you want to achieve a cinematic look, using the Filmic color space and correctly editing your raw render is an absolute must. In my case, I chose to create my scene completely white balanced, for example, and create the blue tint look later in the edit. For that I had to shift the highlights and shadows towards cyan blue, but push the middles towards the warmer side to emulate the look of the movie. The main things I also did was to add back contrast by increasing the gamma and brightness, and increase the vibrance but decrease the saturation. Since the Filmic color space gives you up to 25 stops of dynamic range, you often need to crush your shadows and clip your highlights a bit to get back to a look a camera would actually produce. I also shifted the black point a bit by adjusting my levels. All of this can also be done inside the compositor of Blender. I'm just very familiar with my tools in Photoshop. Speaking of the compositor, the sensor size and lens type also influences the look of your picture. In the compositor, I use the lens distortion node to emulate this a bit. But you can also implement squeezing, lens distortions, bokeh and all the other stuff. I won't talk about all of that now, but plan to talk a bit deeper about it in a future tutorial on how to recreate the look of an anamorphic lens in Blender. So to recap, make yourself familiar with the layout of the environment your single frame is embedded in. Think about the trifecta of modeling, materials and lighting and how they influence each other constantly while working on your scene. Save time where you can and focus on the eye catchers in the scene. Don't shy away from using unique techniques and experiment with unorthodox methods. And lastly, study how editing your raw render changes the image by doing test renders and adjust your scene accordingly. But most importantly, have fun, work at your own pace and don't feel pressured into learning too much at once. As I mentioned, you can study single components while ignoring everything else. First of all, I want to thank you personally that you're still here. We are now at 24 minutes and what I told you so far apparently was interesting enough for you to stay till the end. I would never have thought to reach the amount of people I did with this project, and this tutorial is my way of saying thank you. The official tutorial is now over, why it also says 24 minutes in the title. Now is the time to relax a bit after this information-packed video. If you have any critique about this video, please feel free to let me know in the comments. No matter if positive, negative, to the whole video itself or about a single detail, your comments help me improve in the future. I know that my voice changes sometimes during the video. This comes from me changing the script while editing the video. I also uploaded an hour-long time-lapse video of the whole creation, so please also check out this one if you're interested in that. As mentioned in the beginning, I'm now going to talk a bit about why I chose the Raid 2 and the kitchen fight scene for this project. The Raid 2 is my favorite action film. It's a love letter to the craft of filmmaking and action films in general. It incorporates mind-blowing choreography, a simple yet very effective crime drama story, and beautiful camera work in an absolutely brutal, gut-wrenching movie. This all basically comes down to the genius of Gareth Evans, the writer, director, and editor of this movie. In the description you will find links to videos discussing why the Raid in particular is perfect action, but I also link to videos discussing the current state of action movies in general. And I also link to filmmaking YouTube channels that had a big influence on my film education. Talking about YouTube, I have to mention Blenderguru. After all, his subway tutorial was the video that sparked the idea of recreating movie frames. Apparently he got the same idea from it since he put out a video on how he recreated the lobby from Gone Girl 2 weeks ago. In my opinion, his beginner tutorials are simply the best out there. And most of my fundamental Blender education can be attributed to his work. So please check him out if you haven't already. If we are on the topic of checking things out, if you check out CC0 Textures and HDRI Heaven, please consider donating to them, either directly or via their Patreons. That they put free, super high quality stuff out there should not be taken for granted. Speaking about resources and tutorials, I will quickly talk about my attitude to learning through this whole process. With any of my 6 recreations, I started and had at least one big thing that I had no clue how to do before starting out. I just always had the attitude, I don't know how to do this, but I'm sure I'll figure it out on the go. And that there are resources like the Blender Stock Exchange forum with incredible helpful people or such a large amount of free Blender tutorials out there is the reason I had this attitude. And one last thing I want to talk about is that I plan to do short tutorials in the future. One quick one on the emission node and what beautiful stuff you can do with it. Then another about cloth tricks and how to create cloth without using a cloth simulation. And as already mentioned, I will also create one on how to emulate the look of an anamorphic lens. So if you like this video and want to see more of me in the future, please subscribe and I'll see you on the next one.